All right, so welcome everyone to another Habits and Happiness interview. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pobric, and I'm a certified positive psychology coach, a certified neuro-linguistic practitioner, and former globally certified Dale Carnegie trainer. And I'm also author of this book, Habits and Happiness. Today, I have such a pleasure and honor to introduce amazing guest, and that is Mr. Daniel Horowitz. Daniel Horowitz is the Mary Huggins Gamble Foundation Chair and Professor of American Studies Emeritus at Smith College. He is a historian whose work has focused on the history of consumer culture and social criticism in the United States during the 20th century. He has received fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities and John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. Among his publications are biography of Betty Friedan, and I happen to have a few books right here. So here's a biography of Betty Friedan. And then here's the Anxieties of Affluence. And I gotta say, my favorite, I love them all, but Consuming Pleasures. It just connects so much with today's topic. But today we are here to discuss Mr. Horowitz's latest book, Happier. Mr. Horowitz, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Braco. I appreciate your doing this.
Thank you. So, what inspired you to write a really very first history on positive psychology? And by the way, just to say that this book is so much more than history of positive psychology. We can discuss that later. But what was the real inspiration for you?
There are really three origins of the book. The first goes back to the books you held up, two of them, Anxieties of Affluence and Consuming Pleasures. For 30 years or more, as a historian, I've written on how Americans and eventually Europeans wrestled with consumer culture, pleasure, affluence. So in some ways, Happier is a continuation of that. Secondly, as you and all of those watching us know, it's very difficult for a day to go by without one of us seeing a smiley face, an article in the New York Times about how to achieve happiness, a report of the United Nations, which countries are happier. Almost every day across the screens of our lives comes some news of happiness as an issue. And third, and most immediately, in the fall of 2013, I think, I audited a course at Harvard taught by Nancy Etkoff called The Science of Happiness. It was an undergraduate course, about 17 or 18 students, mostly juniors and seniors, and I was one of two auditors. And I didn't write any of the papers, but I read everything the students read, and I started thinking how to make sense of this as a historian. Nancy Dr. Etkoff, at the end of the semester said, would you give a talk about how you see the field as an outsider, as a historian? And I wrote an essay and gave it to the class. And that's the most immediate origin, but it has origins that go farther back than that.
Great. Thank you so much. You know, in my workshop, I often talk about how, here in West, we needed the research to tell us that things work, that things that people are doing for thousands of years, possibly. Now we say, yeah, that seems like that's working. And you said it so well, and I quote, as marketing ultimately triumphed, it transformed academic disciplines and spirituality into sellable products. Broad audience could be easily reached because experts gave us the obvious: sleep more, have close friends, engage in work, a scientific basis. Can you please expand on this a little bit?
Yes, there are a number of aspects of what you just said. Some of it has to do with a chapter in the book called The Business of Happiness, which is how I, as a historian who lives in a world where most historians outside the classroom don't have don't earn much money or don't have saleable products or don't run coaching classes about history. What can I teach people? How to write a better footnote? That's not quite the same as the useful work you do and others. So some of it comes from my perspective as a historian who looks at this field and sees academics, professors, scientists who move very quickly from the laboratory to the promotion of what you, in the quote you just gave, a saleable product. That is through TED Talks, through foundation support, through workshops, through conventions, the promotion of central ideas behind the study of happiness. And what you said earlier, quoting me, is part of that. This field of positive psychology is a rich, complicated mixture of science, of behavioral science, of psychology, of behavioral economics, but also of Eastern religions. And in bringing in Eastern religions, and we can talk about this more, I'm not a Buddhist myself. I'm a Jew who is more of a cultural than a religious Jew. But my understanding of Buddhism is the practice of it takes an immense amount of focus and concentration. And one of the things that happened in the marketing of positive psychology was turning Buddhism into something that was easy to achieve. All you need was 10 minutes of quiet and some concentration. And then the other part of what we're talking about is, yes, there are obvious things, which you mentioned. Get more sleep. Personal relationships are terribly important. Above a certain level of income, additional dollars provide only very modest increments of pleasure, and be engaged in work. Those, you don't have to be a scientist to understand those. Those are ideas that have been around in society for a long time. What positive psychologists did was provide the scientific evidence to prove that those things were true.
Right. Thank you. You know, you mentioned now Buddhism, and I wanted to read one or more of your quotes from the book.
Yes.
Well, I want to quote you. So you said,
yeah.
and this was really, really amazing. I loved it. You said, overall, and I happen to be part of this field, so just so everybody understands, but I seem to be doing sometimes these things. So you said, overall, positive psychology fudged or avoided all sorts of issues concerning religion and spirituality, just as they and others watered down Buddhism to make it acceptable to mainstream America. Wow.
Yes. So there are two aspects of what you just read. The first is, I think, as my understanding of the research, it's clear that engagement in religion in a religious organization does enhance one's sense of positive well-being. But what's not clear is whether it is the social life that religion provides, the friendship, the comradeship, or the religion itself. And indeed, from what I understand, there's relatively little research done on what I would think is a key question. Are evangelicals happier than, let's say, Unitarian Universalists or Episcopalians? Are Orthodox Jews happier than Muslims? We don't really know the answer to the question. The second issue you've just raised is very interesting to me, and here I relied on a scholarship that others have done. Buddhism comes to America, to the United States, over a long period of time, going back at least to Thoreau and Emerson's engagement with Eastern religions in the 1830s and 40s. But the most important change comes in the post-World War II period, starting perhaps with Alan Watts, and as well as with some Buddhists, Asian Buddhists themselves. But when it comes to America, some practitioners, not all, but most of all popularizers, are worried about that Buddhism is too unscientific and too, may I say, un-American. I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek. And in a reaction, what they do is modify or water down Buddhism to change it from being a rigorous practice that takes a lot of time, maybe a whole lifetime. Some of the work, for instance, of Mathieu Richard makes it clear that the serious practice of Buddhism is a lifetime of work, and that it is an Asian religion brought to the United States and in the process Americanized. And by Americanized, I mean somewhat simplified, made easier to practice, and stripped in some ways by some people, not all, of its more transcendent aspects, and made simpler, more easy to understand, etc.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what we really have to be careful, like you said, how do we translate it? And I think if we take, I know myself, I do take some of the, exercises, if you will, if you think of mindfulness, yes, but I make it very clear, that is not, I'm not teaching Buddhism. We have to make it very clear what we're doing as a practitioner.
Yes, absolutely. And what intrigues me, or what some ways concerns me, I was very careful in what I just said. I kept saying some people, not all. I mean, clearly, those who practice Buddhism or Buddhist-inspired mindfulness are a range of people, from people whose whole life is devoted to that, to people who take 10 minutes a day. And that's we have to acknowledge that.
Sorry, go ahead.
And we also have to acknowledge, and I think this is very important, it is Buddhism, or the American version of Buddhism, and mindful meditation has transformed the lives of tens of millions of people. And nothing in the book is meant to demean that or call that into question. No question about that it has been immensely meaningful and transformative in people's lives. But the variety of how people incorporate it in their lives is considerable.
Thank you. Yeah, no, you made it very clear, and it's very clear in the book as well. So that's why I really wanted to bring it up. I've been part of, this, call it, movement of positive psychology for past, I guess, maybe like 6-7 years. And yes, I noticed something that you really wrote very clearly in your book. And that is that this movement seemed to be, almost exclusive for whites and middle, upper class people. Why do you think is that?
It's certainly something I observe, and you observe. I've been now to 2 meetings of IPA, the International Positive Psychology Association, and there are a lot of people from Australia and Japanese people there too. But among the Americans, it's mostly white, middle and upper middle class Americans. Some of this, and we should also talk about the role of gender in this too.
Yes, gender, race.
Yes, so some of this has to do with the research itself, which is there's relatively little research on race, and there's some certainly on poverty, and the research has very mixed conclusions to it. But this is positive psychology is not unlike many, shall I say, spiritual and religious movements over a long period in American history that have been primarily appealed to white, middle and upper middle class Protestants. Why that's so, I don't think, I can't recall enough research on why that's so. That it is so is very clear. But there, as far as I know, relatively little studies of how people have actually incorporated positive psychology in their lives on a daily basis. And relatively few studies that I know of that explore why some people are not involved and why others are.
No, that is interesting. I mean, I certainly noticed that you know, there was something that I was about to ask you later. You talked about how, you know, to come to, and it's something I certainly really noticed, how some of these conferences are really expensive, right? To take the, you know, master in positive psychology costs $40,000-$50,000 for 1 year. You know, some of the other programs are $6,000-$7,000. Come to the conference is, as you noticed in your book, you know, $800 versus, as you mentioned, going to some of the conferences organized by the history association, $200 or less.
Yes.
So I wonder if this has to do with, you know, it's just.
That's a very good point. I mean, there are, as you note, there are a number of entry points with different price tags for entering this world. And reading a book like your own book is one way, and you could go to a library or buy that book. So we're talking about $10, $15, $20, all the way up to a master's program, which in addition to the costs of the tuition means you have to take some time off from your job.
Yes.
You have to travel to Philadelphia or wherever this would be. You have to stay in a hotel and have meals, etc. So that there's certainly different, we might think of barriers to entry or cost to entry that would of necessity limit the range of people who could do this, who could participate in positive psychology.
Right. You know, there's another thing you noticed, and so did I. We both belong to one of these positive psychology groups where we get, you know, daily probably emails, and some really well-known, without mentioning names, people are participate and do send updates. And during the last election in the U.S., there was some discussion going on. And you noticed, and you write in your book, that the moderator actually shut down the discussion about the election. And so what I wonder is, you know, do you think that movement like this really should be involved in helping people not only become happier, but let's be honest, you know, I think it's our job to help people to deal with stress better, because it's not only, you can't be happy if you are so stressful. So what is your thought on that?
Yes, so let me say what you mentioned, and many people viewing this may want to subscribe to the list. It's called Friends of Positive Psychology. If you have a computer, you subscribe. You and I get someday 3 and 4 messages, but in a week, probably 10. Very spirited discussions. Most of what comes across, as you know, is discussion of the results of new research. But as you and I both noticed, I watched it very carefully especially after mid-October, sparked by an op-ed piece by David Brooks on, I think if I remember, on Trump as a lonely man, a very spirited, intense discussion on this listserv, Friends of Positive Psychology, about the election. And what struck me about it was that the people who participated in it couldn't decide whether their job was to heal each other, heal their clients, or heal the whole society. But it became, as you know, increasingly tense and argumentative set of exchanges, to the point, as you just said, where the moderator had to shut it down. But what struck you and me is, yes, we live in very stressful times. I read 2 newspapers a day. I watch news for hours a day, maybe. And it's very depressing what's going on in the world. I was very struck last week in the New York Times on page 3, there was a guide, a discussion of happiness and self-compassion. But then I looked on the front page And there was one major article that the opioid crisis among African Americans is intensifying at rapid rates. And Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, was actually sinking and would be underwater. And I thought to myself, on the one hand, I say this discussion of self-compassion, and the other hand, I see stories that are so stressful, not to talk about the stressfulness of some of our lives. As you know, the research suggests that commuting and child rearing are among the two most stressful things we do. So making people happier is certainly a goal. And part of that, although not, I think, acknowledged enough, is helping people wrestle with, resolve, deal with the stress both in their private and public lives.
Right. Thank you. Because, during that time, many organizations did publish, guide how to deal with, this is not about politics. And we're not discussing politics, but we're really discussing, how to deal with this.
Yes. And some websites more than others. And I think especially of Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center's website, some websites more than others talked about how do you talk to your children about this issue or that? How do you talk to colleagues about this issue or that? Absolutely.
Yes. So you mentioned a few times, well-known book by Vincent Norman Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking. And I got to tell you, in my workshops, I get this all the time. So now I actually, before people ask me, I address this up front, right? So what's the difference? You have positive thinking and positive psychology. And yet you and I know that positive psychology really stays away from self-help gurus. If you're not scientists doing research on positive psychology, it's almost like you have no space here. I mean, that's the reality. And if you didn't publish many research papers, you really don't belong to that field. What do you think of all of this? I do know that, again, when I think, I actually explain the way that I can the best to my clients, positive thinking versus, positive psychology. And you did say that you call this book the most widely read precursor of positive psychology.
Yes, indeed.
I absolutely agree.
So Norman Vincent Peale, a minister in Manhattan for 50 years, the Marble Collegiate Church, I think it's called, wrote Power of Positive Thinking, 1952. And it sold millions of copies and spawned on his part sermons and talks around the country that he gave and workshops and foundations, etc. And it is a high point or a major point in a long American tradition that goes back at least to Thoreau and Emerson about thinking positively. Mary Baker Eddy and Christian Science in the late 19th century is part of this too. I think there's two striking differences. One is for Peale, God was much more central in Peale's analysis than it is in the writings of most, not all, but most positive psychologists. And the other, of course, major difference is that what academic positive psychologists do is, intentionally or not, take some of the findings of Peale. When you get up in the morning, say to yourself, I'm going to be happy today. Write down during the day 3 things you can do. You know all these things. They're kind of what we think of now as bullet points. So he wrote that, and at the end of many of chapters of his books, there are exercises you're to do. The difference is that academic positive psychologists actually proved through investigations, through neuroscience, through asking people to express gratitude, etc., actually could prove the truth and efficacy of what Peale had written. But it's a tricky business, both acknowledging and distancing yourself from your precursor. And I have an expression I use in the book that many academic positive psychologists both policed and crossed the border between science and self-help. So that by the 1990s, certainly early in this century, many positive psychologists are writing books that in some ways are how-to books. And I mean by that, academics do that. There are, as you know, there are both academics and non-academics writing in this field, and the difference between them is not always a clear, sharp line.
So interesting you went to this, because I was about to ask you that question, where, do you think, based on your research and really extensive, history, background, and knowledge, that scholars and researchers should possibly stay with the research and provide more and more research, and let journalists and, authors and, practitioners write, people who deal with this on an everyday basis with their clients or whoever, right?
Yes.
Do the writing.
Yes. That's a wonderful question. And again, I come to this as a historian. When I took the course from Dr. Nancy Edkoff, I was struck by her saying at one point that taking this course might actually make you happier, reading some of these articles. I can't imagine saying to the students I taught at Smith College and elsewhere that taking my course in history would make you happier. It might make you smarter or wiser or get to think more systematically, whatever, but happier, no. So I'm very struck by the quickness with which academics moved from experiment into the popular realm. That's something historians don't do. I could name for you a couple, 2 or 3 U.S. historians who have a wide readership, but not millions. So I'm not sure I want to say that academic psychologists should not write across the border and write how-to books. I think they should be slower to go from experimental science to popularization, in part because almost everything, almost all the studies that they have made are contested and are on maybe a large amount of agreement on something. But in 2 years, there'll be an article that comes out, a scholarly article that comes out and says, well, it really isn't this way. Mm-hmm. So I, as a historian, very much honor the work of non-academics, yourself included, who bring these findings into a wider audience. But I'm not sure I want to say that professors shouldn't do that.
Of course.
Yes.
I think I made a very too strong statement.
No. Yes.
So, it's interesting you said that, because I had a discussion with Dr. Chad Barton, and he's the one who did that 3-minute journaling with Dr. Laura King. And so I had a really good discussion with him, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, Chad, you are well known. He was, what do you mean I'm well known? I said, well, we all know about your research. And he said, Brad, so honestly, I am just so happy to hear that you and people like yourself will take what we do and bring it. Because he said, what I do is I work on a research, and by the time I come to the end, my only goal is to get the funding for next research. Like, I have no clue what happened to my research. And I think this is what a lot of researchers do. And that's why some of them are grateful that, that some of us take this and read, hundreds of pages of research papers to take out a few bullets that, we can use.
Yes. That's a wonderful point. And again, I come to it as a historian, unable to, I think, almost mention any historian who is well known in a wider public and who has moved from scholarly article to advice, certainly not, except on very specific issues like whether to tear down historical monuments or rename buildings that were named for slave owners. But that's very specific. We're talking here in positive psychology about something much, much broader and more ambitious.
Yeah, I think sorry, go ahead.
Yes, you go ahead.
No, just happiness became so popular, and now, we can, like you said, it's sellable products, and we can just sell happiness everywhere.
Yes. Yes, I have a little collection. I have a lunchbox with a smiley face on it. And inside are things I collected at the IPA meetings, pencils and badges about promoting happiness. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I feel ashamed of that too, but I don't do it as much. So, you in your book, Happier, you really, like I said, it's just much more than history of positive psychology. You talk about, the founders, where they come from, all these people. You talk about so many researchers in the book. And, I was happy to learn that there are some that I really never heard of. Is there any research that kind of like really stuck with you, either for any reason, one reason or another, that you say, this kind of really stuck with me?
Well, to begin with, there are two things that I understood very well beforehand through my life and my writings that were confirmed. And one is that above a certain income, what matters is good health and friendship. And that experiences are more pleasurable, provide more meaningful pleasure than do goods. And I think many of us understand that to be true. And the other thing I well understood, lived my life by before, is the importance of social relations, both with my students and with colleagues and with friends. So none of that didn't come as a surprise to me. The work of Richard Davidson at Wisconsin, probably the preeminent neuroscientist involved in this field, that I knew nothing of, absolutely nothing of before. I knew nothing about neuroscience. I worked hard in the book to explain the scientific basis, the way neuroscience enables scientists to locate in the brain the locus of specific emotions. That's extraordinary work. So that I was absolutely fascinated by the neuroscience of this. It came late to me to learn about the role of religion in positive psychology and what I talked about before, this question of whether the theology, the belief system itself, or the social relations were very important. I think the neuroscience and the role of religion were the two things I had no idea about before. A lot of what's in the book, a tremendous amount of it, I knew nothing about before. Some of the origins in the post-war period of this field, and some of the most important research now. Yes.
So you mentioned religion. I remember Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who and he's really became my mentor, and really one of the individuals in positive psychology that I very, very much respect. He basically said that if nothing else, religion, regardless what religion, they got one thing, and that's rituals. All right, yeah. And as you know, I did a lot of research on habits, so we know that having a good rituals and good habits, and that's really what every religion brings to people.
Yes,
one thing.
Some more than others.
Yeah,
right?
Correct.
Some branches of Protestantism, especially, that have tried to minimize the importance of religion. But as a cultural and somewhat practicing Jew, I understand. I grew up in a household where a whole series of rituals that mark the day, the week, the month, the year were central to my life and are burned deep, deep in my soul. I certainly understand that, and how those rituals bind us together across time and within communities. Absolutely. Right. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
1984 is actually very important here in my life. Back then, Sarajevo, we had 1984 Olympic Winter Games in Sarajevo, which is the city I was born and grew up in. And I was actually back then, I worked for Olympic committee and, had really great memories. But you defined 1984 as a turning point in the history of happiness studies. Can you tell us why? You did explain a lot in your book, but can you tell us why you chose 1984?
Yes. So, as you know, there's a scholar, Professor Ed Diener, who in 1984 writes one of those classic articles in scholarly field that says, here is where the field has gone and here is where it might go. And it was a masterful job that summarized a vast amount of scholarship, and in some ways announces as a field the arrival of positive psychology. I consider Diener, whom I've emailed with but never met, a scholar's scholar. He is probably over the longest period of time, starting in the 70s and continuing now, he and his wife and his son and but he especially have really shaped the field in a major way by doing articles that really, that first of all, were lucid and easy to read, and second of all, really advanced the field enormously. Yes. So there are, as you know in the book, various origin stories. I talk extensively about the immediate, about happiness studies being born in the misery of the dislocations of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Martin Seligman's 1998 presidential address at the American Psychological Association. Those are really important markers. But I think that 84 is when the field begins to take self-conscious shape.
Great. I was actually very happy to see what you wrote about Ed Diener and that history, because he's, as you and I discussed earlier, certainly one of the individuals who I respect very, very much, and who doesn't seem to get so much involved in the other side. He's kind of seems to say
he is not a public figure.
Yeah.
In the way some others are. But that's why I say he's a scholar.
He really is a scholar.
Whose most important work is scholarly, not so much writing for a broader audience or appealing to a broader audience.
Right,
yes.
Right. So in your book, you talked about Mount Rushmore that applies to positive psychology. And I love that story. Can you share that with us, please?
Yes. So there's a magazine, a glossy, popular magazine called Live Happy. And I forget the date. It's in the book, but they had a picture of Mount Rushmore, not with Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and George Washington, but with what the editors felt were the five key people. Put on the cover, five people in a Mount Rushmore pose: Sonia Lyubomirsky, Barbara Fredrickson, Martin Seligman, Mike Csikszentmihalyi, and Ed Diener. Of course, anytime you say these five are the key people, you leave off others who are just as important. One would be one of my favorites, Ruth Veenhoven, a Dutch sociologist who has been writing about positive psychology and happiness since the 70s, or some of the behavioral economists who are terribly important, Richard Layard in Great Britain. So any time you say these five are the canon, that's a problem. But it's a great picture, and I play off it using it as a heuristic, a teaching device. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So, I would like to close this interview by going, kind of beginning and the end of your book. And, where actually you and I met at the International Post-Psychology Association Conference 2015 in Florida. And, you did talk about the conference and what impressed you and what was your thoughts. Is there something you would like to share from the conference, just kind of as a final thoughts? I think you were probably in the middle of writing the book, and then you wanted to really get inside.
Yeah, I was probably halfway through. One of the most important things, of course, was meeting you, which was a chance meeting.
Thank you.
I think we were standing in line at a restaurant. Was it something like that?
Yes.
With our wives. And as you know, it was held at Disney World. So the title of the last chapter is The Happiest Place on Earth, and playing off Walt Disney's vision of happiness and that of the International Positive Psychology Association. I learned two things, two strands of scholarship, or the work of three people that I just didn't know about. Wasn't on my screen. And one was Richard Davidson, and another University of Wisconsin scholar, Carol Reif, and then a wonderful talk by Kenneth Parmagent, if I pronounce it right, on the role of religion in positive psychology. The role of neuroscience and of religion were just issues that I probably knew about them, but I wasn't focused on them. And that was a very, very important moment for me. It was also important, as you know, from reading the last chapter, to my wife, whose mother had recently died at age 97. And my wife, Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz, also a historian, learned things at that meeting more than I did that were important for her own life. For how to deal with adversaries in a tricky situation, how to come to terms with loss, and how to practice meditation, which she had learned, a form of which she had learned, a 19th century form in college in the early 1960s. So for me, it was a wonderful moment of understanding that. And then, as you know in the book also, I was very struck by the difference between a meeting of positive psychologists and of historians. When historians meet, for better or worse, the meetings are sober. The talks are very serious. They're not like TED Talks. They're delivered to an audience. But I was very struck at this conference by the way in which, in some ways, it was like a revival meeting, that the president of the association would begin an evening by saying, "Good evening," and no one would respond, and then he'd say, "Good evening," until people responded enthusiastically. It's impossible to imagine that happening among historians. I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's different. Or the exercise that at one moment, it was a talk by the late Shane Lopez, when we were asked to turn to the person next to us and to share something. And the person next to me was actually a U.S. Army officer, or I'm not sure he was an officer, but a member of the U.S. Army who was involved in the comprehensive soldier fitness program, an attempt to use positive psychology to enhance the resilience of soldiers who had multiple stays in Afghanistan and Iraq. So again, I can't imagine a history meeting where a speaker would say, "Now turn to the person next to you and say this." So I was very struck by the difference in the form of these, as well as as you know, what you don't know is a history meeting, the conference would have a large room where books would be displayed, but only books. But at the IPA meeting, there would be not just books, but advertisements for graduate programs, for exercises you could do, for products that were available for online sites, etc. So I was very struck by the difference between that world and the world I come from.
You know, I'm happy you shared it because, you know, that world that was there, it's kind of like my world, right? So when I go out and, you know, people don't respond, hello, come on, boy. And I'm used to that. And it's interesting, you know, to really see, you know, what's happening at the other conferences.
Yes. I did go to the second one in Montreal a couple months ago in June of 17. And it began, or one evening began, with an improv group that performed, often performs goes into corporations to increase the positivity among people in corporations. But again, they had these, I think there were two women, had us go through a series of exercises that they do in other settings. But an improv group in a history conference, that wouldn't happen. So it was very striking.
That's great. That's great. You know, we if it's okay, we talked earlier privately about your next thing. Is it okay to share? I would love to know what's happening. You know, first people have to get this book and buy Happier book and read this. And then we're going to look forward for your next chapter, next book.
Many times in the past, this is my seventh book, and many times in the past 15 years, I've said to myself, this is the last book. I'm not going to. And you know, I mean, writing a book is not easy. I mean, you've got to keep all the threads together. You got to remember what I said in chapter 1. Do I repeat it here? You've got to keep your audience in mind. You've got to have an imagined audience that you're trying to reach. And for those of us like you, and when I was teaching, we had day jobs. And I wrote by getting up at 4 a.m. And now I'm retired, but still writing. So my next project, which I'm about halfway done with, there's a television program called Shark Tank on ABC and CNBC. And I don't know if have you ever seen it?
Yeah, actually, I'll show you later on the picture with what's his name. Yes, I have.
Yes,
I don't really watch it much, but yeah.
I'm turning my life as a couch potato into my life as a professional analyst of a cultural phenomenon. Some of those in your audience may not know. It's a show on which people come and they've developed a business, perhaps, let's say, a positive psychology website, and they've developed it already and had 10,000 people sign up, but they now think with better investment and help, they can make this an immense project. So they appear before a panel of 5 wealthy, in some cases very wealthy people, and they say, I want $10,000 or $100,000 from you for 10% of my happy app. And the sharks laugh or compete with each other. But what I'm trying to get at here, which is very different from the Happier book, is how television teaches us about the economy. So that's what
that is really interesting. I can't wait to see that.
Yes.
That's really interesting. So, Mr. Horowitz, thank you very, very much. It was such an honor. I certainly love your work. I am so honored to have you as a friend and colleague, and spending time with your wife, Helen, like you said 2 years ago. What I really love, I mean, a lot of things, but what I think it's so important, you truly wrote the history of positive psychology with all the facts, and yet you're letting us readers really decide for ourselves, what do we want to get out of this movement, if anything? How do we want to be involved, if at all, and so on. So it was really, 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 really great.
Thank you. And I honor and appreciate your work and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome.